Chapter 11, verses 23 through 26. And as I read this, listen for God speaking to you. The desire of the righteous ends only in good, the expectation of the wicked in wrath. Some give freely, yet grow all the richer. Others withhold what is due and suffer only want. A generous person will be enriched, and the one who gives water will get water. The people curse those who hold back grain, but a blessing is on the head of those who sell it. And our second scripture comes from Paul's letter to Timothy, his first letter to Timothy, chapter 6, verses 17 through 19. And again, as I read this, listen for God speaking to you. As for those who in the present age are rich, command them not to be haughty or to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but rather on God who richly provides us everything for our enjoyment. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, generous and ready to share, thus storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of the life that really is life. Family, this is the word of the Lord. When I first arrived to the campus of Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia, I quickly realized that I was one of the only students there who was from the Midwest. And in fact, I was the only student there from Minnesota. The vast majority of my peers were from Virginia all the way down to South Carolina, and for that reason, I always was on the receiving end of some good-natured teasing on being from a flyover state. And they teased me, and I was okay with it. We all laughed about it. Until one day, the teasing stopped. And that was the day that 12 inches of snow descended upon the city of Richmond. And my friends who had never seen snow in their life found themselves terrified. School was canceled, and they were all in their rooms, and they didn't know where to go, and they didn't have any food because they didn't prepare for such a catastrophe like 12 inches of snow, and they needed someone to help them drive to the grocery store. Sounds like a perfect job for someone who was born and raised in Minnesota, right? And I'll tell you what, I was gracious. I was gracious, and I mean that not even sarcastically for those who know me well. I actually was gracious, and I decided that as a service to the community, a service to my friends, to try to educate some southern drivers how to drive in inclement weather, I thought that I would teach a few of my friends how to drive in the snow. And it was an interesting experience trying to articulate some of these practices that I have internalized having to drive in the snow growing up. And I realized that there are a lot of things that we are supposed to do when we find ourselves in the snow that seem counterintuitive to our natural instincts when we're driving. For instance, when we find ourselves starting to slide or swerve, it's important that instead of slamming on the brakes, that we actually just gently let our feet off the gas and let the traction find itself again. And when we find ourselves starting to fishtail, it's important that we turn against the skid instead of into the skid. But I had the hardest time trying to teach my friends this because they had these habits and they had these instincts. And when that moment came, everything in them wanted to slam on the brakes or turn into the skid. So I realized that a lot of what I had to do was to encourage my friends to unlearn these things that they thought they were certain about and to embrace and accept the practices of driving in the snow that I know work in the end. Now, when we choose to believe in the risen Lord and we choose to follow Christ in everything that we do, we will inevitably find ourselves trying to do the same thing, which is to unlearn the things in our own minds and our own lives that we have convinced ourselves is right in order to follow Christ. Because to believe in Christ is to believe that Jesus' ways are better than our ways. And when we believe that, and when we strive to follow Christ, we will find ourselves in these moments where we will have to choose between doing what we think is right, what we know is right, what we know is best for us. Choose between that and to follow Jesus. Well, today we're going to talk about one of those moments that we might struggle with in life, and those are the opportunities for us to be generous. And we're going to talk about generosity as it has to do with joy as we conclude our series on unlocking the joy of the Lord. It's been an amazing few weeks as we have gathered and we have explored what it means to embrace this joy that God intends for us. And over the last few weeks, I hope that we have found ways in our own lives for us to embrace that joy. Not just settling for happiness, but striving for joy. And that we have made time for joy in the midst of our busy schedules. And that even when we find ourselves consumed with grief and loss and suffering, that we cling to the hope that brings us to the joy of knowing that God is present in our lives and that God is present in the world. And today we're going to wrap all of this up and we're going to actually start to talk about what happens when we do embrace joy. We're going to see how joy will lead us to generosity. And paradoxically, generosity will lead us to abundance. I love the book of Proverbs, even though, admittedly, I probably don't read it enough. If I would probably not get myself in as much trouble as I do. Because Proverbs is a book full of writings and sayings that try to encourage us how to live a righteous life, how to live righteously. And in it, it's very practical. There are these nuggets of wisdom, life lessons that show us how to follow God. And in the passage today, the author links being righteous with being generous. And that the desires of those who are righteous will find themselves desiring to be generous. But in explaining generosity, I love what it says here. Some give freely, yet grow all the richer. A generous person will be enriched. The one who gives water will get water. And I think in this, what we start to see, the author is pointing to what I like to call the paradox of generosity. And the paradox of generosity is this. The more we give, the more we give away, the more we give to others, the more that we are generous, the more we will experience abundance in life. And I don't mean this in this earthly, material, temporary prosperity type of abundance. What I mean is that the more that we are generous, as it says here in Proverbs, we will experience abundance in life. And there's a very specific reason for this. And the reason is that we experience abundance in being generous because God's relationship with us is fundamentally based on generosity. From Adam to Abraham, from Moses to David, from David to the people of Israel in exile who were then brought back, and then of course God who has been revealed to us in Jesus Christ, all point us to this reality that God is nothing but generous towards us. God is generous with His presence. we see this in Scripture that God is involved in our lives, even though we probably don't deserve it. We see that God is generous with His love. Again, even though we don't deserve it. And God is generous with His grace and His forgiveness and His guidance, even though we don't deserve it. Time and time again, God has shown us that generosity is the natural way of relationships. And that's where we find abundance. Because when we choose to be generous with others, when we choose to give away what has been given to us, we are pursuing the natural way of relationships. And for that reason, we experience the abundance of God's presence. And that abundance will lead us to joy. But if generosity is so natural, if it's the way that God has designed for us to relate to one another and to others, why does it feel so unnatural at times? If we look at it in terms of our finances, let's split our budget into 3 areas. The first are the areas that we have to spend money on, that we absolutely have to spend money on. Housing, food, taxes. These things that if we don't spend our money on that, we will either face penalty or we will cease to live on this earth. And then the second category that we spend money on are the things in life that we like to spend money on. Hobbies. Things that bring us happiness. I like to spend money on golf. I spend a lot of money on golf balls because I lose golf balls all the time. So we have things in life that we have to spend money on. We have things in life that we enjoy spending money on. And then we have that third category, which is the things that we spend where we are giving our money away. Whether that's giving it to a charity or giving it to church, giving our money back to the Lord by faithfully tithing. And how many of us find a way to cover categories 1 and 2, but we struggle with the third? How many of us, if we have received a promotion in our jobs, or if we've received a raise, or if we have had a favorable year of investments and the return is great, how many of us struggle to find a way to be more generous? And we always find ourselves putting that money in category 1 or category 2. And this is just financial generosity I'm talking about. This can extend to relational generosity or emotional generosity, spiritual generosity. All of us have these opportunities to be generous, but it makes us nervous to give more, to be bold in our generosity. Because it feels unnatural. And I think it feels unnatural because we are broken people. We're sinful people. We live in a world that is we still have to grapple with death. And for that reason, we sometimes fall for this myth of scarcity. And we think that we have limited finances, and we think that we have limited love to give to others, and we think that we have limited power and influence. And so when we are trying to figure out how to spend the resources that God has given us, we find ourselves afraid of giving it away because it somehow comes at a cost to us. And sometimes that fear of scarcity can paralyze us, can't it? It can sometimes make it so hard to follow God's call, to do the natural thing and to be generous. But God doesn't want us to be paralyzed with fear. Because God abundantly gives us His love, and that love allows us to be generous with others. In 1 Timothy, Paul, I think, writes about this reality in life, which is that some of us will have more materially than others. This is just a fact of living in our world. Some will have more than what they need, and others will have less than what they need and struggle to get by. But instead of blaming those who have less and saying somehow that they deserve it, they haven't worked hard enough, and instead of blaming the rich to say the rich are somehow evil just because they have a lot of money, Paul says, look, some of you are going to be rich. And some of you are going to be poor. This is just the reality. So instead of trying to blame one group or to blame the other group, how about the people who are rich be generous with those who have less? Because that is what God has done. God who has so much, who is so rich, infinitely rich, and freely and generously gives to us who don't have enough. Paul says, why don't the rich help by being generous take care of those who have less? And I know that we can get into political arguments about the role that the government plays in this call. And I can see the shoulders get close to the ears. People are getting tense right now because they think I'm going to get political or partisan. But no matter what our political system does, no matter what our government does, and we can debate about the role that the government plays in generosity, there is no debate on our role as Christians, as those who follow God, that all of us are called to be boldly generous. Because when we are generous with others, this is what Paul writes, we will experience the joy of the Lord. And we will experience that because we will start seeing God in our relationships. Because as God is generous with us, and then we are generous towards others, we start to feel God's love in those relationships. And that will lead us to joy. We will see joy in being a part of God's amazing plan for humanity. And that will lead us to joy. And we will experience joy when we watch others around us transform and we come face to face with the power of the risen Christ. Family, generosity leads us to joy, and joy leads us to more generosity so that we can go into the world and show everyone what it means to truly be generous. And I don't know about you, but when I look around, I see a world that is horrible at generosity right now. Churches and nonprofits all across the country, these organizations that are primarily focused on helping others, are closing and struggling to stay afloat. Organizations that have been around for decades but are now watching the wells run dry because people aren't giving as much. That shows our struggle to be generous with our finances. I've been incredibly moved and even brought to tears with the Me Too movement. I've listened to women come forward and tell their stories of how they've been sexually harassed or abused or assaulted. And yes, I see it on TV, but I'll tell you what really hits me is when I hear it from my friends, my colleagues, those who I know and love. And it makes me weep. And it reminds me that we are not always generous with our love towards one another. And our current political reality, and by current, I'm going to be generous and say, as long as I've been alive, I've seen our elected officials come to power, exert their power, give revenge, hold grudges. When we look at Washington, we see a group of elected leaders who are more interested in power than serving the people. And this is a problem on both sides of the aisle. This isn't a Republican problem. It's not a Democrat problem. It is a human problem. And it tears us as a nation apart. We can't even talk to one another about how to treat one another. And it's because right now our leaders are showing us just how horrible we are at being generous with our power. When is enough going to be enough? When are we as human beings going to say no to the ways of greed and no to the ways of selfishness and strive for something better? It's not going to be a president or a new president that's going to bring us there. And it's not going to be a political party that's going to bring us there. It is going to be the risen Lord who brings us to this place. And it is going to be the people of God alone who can rise up and say, we want to live in a world of selfless love, of gracious living. We want to live in a world of bold generosity, where instead of holding on to what we have and isolating ourselves, that we are going to open our arms wide, open our wallets wide, open our hearts wide, open our spirits wide, and say, I'm going to give what I can give because God has given to us what God has given to us. And we're not there yet. We are not there yet, but we will be. Because that's what God has promised. And if we can embrace generosity, if we can embrace God's generosity and strive to be generous towards others, not only will we be full of joy, but we can help bring joy to the whole world. So as we conclude not only our time today, but as we conclude this series on joy, we've looked at different aspects of joy. I'd like for all of us to reflect, where are we? Are we joyful in our own hearts? Are we joyful as a community? Do we seek time for joy? Do we proclaim joy even in the midst of the worst that life has to throw to us? Are we generous? Are we boldly generous? And if we're struggling in an area, I want all of us to know that we are not alone. That we are the people of God. We are the family of God. And it is in that family of believers that we can find each other, and we can support one another, and we can help each other discover that joy, not just for our own sake, but so that the whole world may be transformed. I'd like to close this time in this series by sharing some words that one of my professors from seminary would always say was a blessing that he would give us at the end of our Hebrew class. And I don't remember too much Hebrew at all, but I remember the life lessons he taught us, and I remember this. And I think he speaks some words about joy and how we get joy and how we are called to seek joy together. So please hear these words. Let us offer to each other all that we have to offer. But never base our love on that. Lest when what we have to offer each other ends, so too shall our so-called love end. Let us strive not to fail each other, but never base our love on that, lest when we do fail each other, the love we base on that also fails. Some communities say it is folly. Some say it is fantasy. And some say it is a lie. But we find ourselves included in a community that declares that there is a love from, in, and of God, and that this love never ends, and never fails. Therefore, beloved, may joy and nothing less find you on the way. May you be blessed, and may you be a blessing. And may light guide you, and countless others we should not have thought even to invite all the way home. Shalom and amen.